Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode. I'm here for the second time with Filip Holm. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be back.
I'm very excited to talk today and to follow up on our previous episode that we had, where we talked about Sufi history and tradition and some practices and poetry. And today we're gonna dive deeper into the mysticism and also the practices of
Mm.
Sufism. So I want to just give a intro for those who haven't listened to that first podcast, although I recommend everyone to listen to that as well to get a comprehension of the Sufi tradition. But Filip is also here in Sweden, where I'm based, and he has a master's degree in comparative religion and has studied the topic extensively for many years. And he brings that experience into Let's Talk Religion, which is his beautiful educational YouTube channel and podcast. And it's all about religion, history, and philosophy. And there's many different topics on that podcast or yeah, your YouTube channel. And it's so beautifully done, as well, as I mentioned in the previous and it almost has 1 million
Yeah.
subscribers, which says a lot about the content. And as I described last time, I found you when I was studying religion and also writing about Sufism and the mystical path of Sufism. I was writing about that. So a warm welcome to you.
Thank you. And thank you for the kind words and introduction.
Your work is amazing, so it deserves some good attention. And I'm really so we've gone through why you studied this and how you came about to share this knowledge. And I think now is so just to give a context, I was also studying master's course uh, which was called Mystical and Paranormal Experiences. So
Mm.
I learned a little bit about Sufism in that course, and then I did a Sufi path for a year, and it was so. Maybe we could start by what is what is the definition of a mystical experience, because it can mean so many things, and then maybe we can weave it into what it means for this in within the Sufi tradition and
Yeah.
how yeah.
It's a good question, but it's a very difficult question because as you know, having studied the topic probably, is that mystical and mystical experience is a term or terms that are very much debated and disagreed upon. Um, Usually when we talk about mysticism or a mystical experience, it is defined as being some sort of experience of transcending the usual limited consciousness and experiencing, often the language used is union with God or union with the divine or with the absolute, depending on the tradition and so on. I like a bit of a broader definition from Bernard McGinn, he particularly is an expert on Christian mysticism. And he says that mysticism is, let's see if I can remember the quote here. He doesn't use experience, I think. Maybe it is experience. So it's the direct apprehension or experience of the presence of God, or again of the absolute, maybe. So it's this experience that goes beyond words, and this is what all the Sufis say as well. Rumi, in the beginning of his Masnavi, he talks about love as being at least one of the ways of describing or giving a name to this experience or this reality, that it's something that is completely beyond words, completely beyond concepts, but is experienced as something that is innately real and more real than everyday reality, and that it is an experience of something beyond yourself, your limited self, and maybe even in some traditions like this sense of disappearing or being united with this higher reality. That's at least one common way of describing what mystical experience would be.
That's a great explanation, because it can maybe be interpreted in many ways also outside of the academic world. So I think it's great to have a little framework, and it feels like all different paths that we've studied can have that component. And yeah, it's interesting. I think we were studying the a Kabbalistic mystical path at the same time, which was also interesting. And it feels like in different traditions that it's kind of the similar experiences, but in different shapes. So, like you said, and then
It certainly seems that way, yeah.
yeah, and then with the Sufism, sometimes it's said to be the mystical path in Islam, and it doesn't exclude that you can have a mystical experience within any type of path. But how has that, was that something in your studies that happened right in the, we've spoken about the history, but how did that evolve? Because it must have been specific intentions and experiences that people had that they wanted to continue harness. So maybe we can dive into the Sufi mystical path.
So what you mean is that in the early days, as Sufism developed, what were the mystical components that sort of gave that inspired that development? Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, and how it evolved. Yeah.
So when we talk about Sufism and its development, and without going into the history too much because we talked about that last time, but Sufis will of course say that path, that tradition goes back to the Prophet Muhammad himself, and maybe even before him. There's a famous saying by Ali Hujwiri, who's one of the Sufis. He said that before, Sufism was a reality without a name. Now it is a name without a reality. And he writes, I think, in the 10th century. So from a emic internal perspective, these experiences, this path, and this tradition has always been there. But looking just from a sort of historical academic perspective, the earliest clear examples, are in people like Rabia al-Basri, Ma'ruf al-Karhi in Baghdad, and these kinds of people. And it seems that they are, except maybe for Rabia, but they are quite careful about expressing these experiences. It's quite clear when you read their works, what survives of them or the stories told about them, that they had very powerful experiences. But there seems to have been this expectation that you weren't supposed to divulge these secrets publicly in writings. But when you read someone like Rabia, who was a early female Sufi or proto-Sufi mystic, it's very clear that she has this. She has these profound experiences of love, what she describes as love, an intimacy with the divine. She's famous for not having married. She had no children. She spent her whole life just dedicated to God. And the way she talks about God in her poetry is this intimate love relationship almost. There's a famous saying by her which she says, if I worship you out of fear of hell, then lock the gates of hell for me. If I worship you out of desire for paradise, then again lock the doors of paradise. But if I worship you out of love for you alone, then do not deny me your everlasting beauty. So even though I think we'll get into that in terms of the practice, there is of course this emphasis on you need to follow the exterior practices of Islam. There's this intense experience of love that seems to run through even these early Sufis, even if they don't use the word love, but some kind of intimate relationship. We have stories of There's a story of Dhul Nun, who is an Egyptian mystic, early 9th century, where he visits Baghdad and he comes to this gathering of Sufis, and there are qawwals singing like Sufi music or poetry, and he enters this ecstatic state and falls to the ground and faints because he was overcome by this experience that was triggered by this beautiful music. And these early Sufis, they developed language around these kinds of experiences. For example, terms like ma'arifa, which is hard to translate, but it's like knowledge, but it's more maybe mystical knowledge, or sometimes translated as Gnostic knowledge. They talk about experiencing, which is what he would have experienced, maybe wajd, which means like ecstasy, or ecstasy is a good word, like a trance state of bliss, essentially. And the utmost experience, or at least one of the utmost experiences that one can have, is described by the term fana, which means annihilation. And that's one of those things that really these early Sufis are careful about, except for this one very famous figure, who is of course Al-Hallaj, who is famous for having exclaimed, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, or I am the real, in one of these moments of pure ecstasy where he felt like he had transcended himself, or he had realized that his concept, I mean, how can I even try to put into words what he experienced? But the way it's described, it's like this experience of having completely annihilated yourself, or realized that you don't exist and only God exists. So even from those earliest Sufis, whether it's the Dhul Nun and many others like him, who sort of go into this ecstatic state, or Rabia's intense love, or this idea of somehow being able to access this ma'arifa, this other kind of knowledge that's not conceptual, that's not learned through books or through words, but is learned directly through experience. There's a beautiful word in Arabic called dhawq, which means tasting. And I think it's the perfect word for that, because it's like taste is something you can only know truly by experiencing it. You can never have the taste of something described to you. And over the centuries, so going into the second part of the question, which was the sort of development of it, these figures that I described, not a lot of writings from them survive. It's a lot of later stories about them. And it happened sometime in the 11th century primarily, where a lot of these Sufi manuals start to come out by people like Qushayri and Sulami and Saraj and so on. And they often have these long lists of like concepts or terms, like what is wajd, what is love, what is wujud, what is fana, and they will describe them. So it became more systematized over time, primarily in the 11th and 12th centuries. But like the foundations for the kinds of experiences that were accessed and how they were described and talked about, understood, we can see that already in the 8th, 9th century with the earliest historical Sufis. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that was a great overview of. There's a lot to uncover in those what you just shared, and the different mystics, because many different traditions have mystics, even in Christianity and in Judaism, and it sounds also like, in Bhakti, when the same thing with reciting God's names in Sufism, in the Bhakti tradition, chanting also, like the name, it's like a way of, like you said, it's a relationship and an experience of the divine, which can be, and Bhakti is also like very loved based, and it can take shape in different relationships to the divine. And I was just looking at the mystical experience. I've written that it can be defined as an experience in a religious or secular context that is interpreted either immediately or later as an encounter with something higher or ultimate reality. And then they can both occur within religious context, but also secular, and it can feel like life-changing.
Yeah.
And then that repetitive prayer and meditation can be one. It can also be an intellectual dimension through reflection, and it can occur spontaneously. So within the Sufi tradition and the mystics, there's been like devotional practices and also different types of meditations and recitations. The one I wrote about specifically was dhikr and Samaa. So when it's interesting how it evolved, because as you said, it all began with mystical experiences of the prophet, and then it like it's interesting how also the Hindu tradition and this kind of merged in the East and how it looks there. And I'm wondering, it's interesting in the present moment, since Sufism has kind of two aspects. It's like based in the, I don't know if we want to call it East and West, but how it's spread just as any other tradition that has spread. But I guess that there's different ways of practice, and maybe some are more in the traditional sense. Because I remember also writing about like intense practices in Sufism, which can be likened to yogic practices of like not being in the body, like fasting and being like sensory deprived for a long time to be able to see. So I'm just curious how when the manuals were done, like what was the main factors in it? What did they focus on first?
In terms of practice?
Yeah.
Very good question. As you said, a lot to unpack and a lot of very interesting avenues to explore there. In terms of practice, there is a lot of diversity in Sufism. First of all, at least in terms of the traditional classical forms of Sufism, and most forms of Sufism still today, there is like the first step of it is, because it's an Islamic, or it comes from an Islamic tradition at least, the outer practices of Islam, what's referred to in the tradition as Sharia, which is like praying 5 times a day and fasting and so on, those are prerequisites. So Rumi, for example, in the Masnavi, he compares the whole spiritual path. There are 3 terms often used in Sufism, or 3 aspects that are interrelated and important. And it's the Sharia, the Tariqa, and the Haqiqa. And sometimes there's also Ma'arifa, which I mentioned before in there. Rumi describes this as you're walking on a path. The Sharia, the outer practice, is like a candle that you hold so you can see where you're going. The Tariqa, or the sort of Sufi spiritual path, is the path itself that you walk on. And then hopefully, with the help of the candle and the path, you will get to your destination. So, but speaking specifically of the more unique Sufi practices, there are many diverse forms of meditation and chanting and music. The most common, which is what you described, is of course dhikr, which means remembrance. And this can be done in many different ways. It is usually, so dhikr is done by all Muslims. It's said in the Quran that you should do dhikr, you should remember God. But the Sufis have ritualized dhikr, either by themselves or often in a group setting. So what you do is you will just like in the Bhakti tradition, as you mentioned, you chant names of God or the proclamation of faith, La ilaha illallah, or other phrases that in repeated fashion. And this is a kind of meditation. And this is when we, even in the manuals, it's clear that this is like the main practice, but it can take many different forms. So the most sort of common famous example is that Sufis will sit maybe in a circle, or they will stand up sometimes, and they will again like chant a name of God or several names of God, and they will do this in unison together for long periods of time, and this will help them. So it's in the name, right? Remembrance. It's to remember the divine, and by remembering the divine, you're sort of cleaning. You're polishing away that dirt from the mirror of your heart, which is your conceived sense of self, right? So you're forgetting who you think you are, or your individual limited self, and remembering God or the absolute, or whatever name you want to use it for it. And so you could call that a kind of meditation. There's always also Samaa, as you mentioned, which is more focused on listening. But arguably, even Samaa is a kind of dhikr, right? Almost all forms of Sufi practice is some form of dhikr. Samaa is listening to music, or sometimes dancing, or listening to poetry that is able to elevate your soul and take you to a place of wajd, or an ecstatic state, a transcendent state. Also, in these early manuals, they talk a lot about things like khalwa, which is seclusion. And this is when a Sufi adept, very importantly, on instruction by his master or his sheikh, he will, or she, they will go into seclusion in a cell or in a cave somewhere, and they will stay in seclusion. Usually the time is 40 days, and they will spend that time fasting and meditating and doing dhikr by themselves intensely. That's all they do for 40 days. And that's usually seen as like towards the end of the path. Like that's the last, almost like a graduation thing, because when you do that, as one might imagine, intense things start happening when you deprive yourself of all the usual comforts of everyday life. There's also, generally in Sufism and in these manuals, general practices like fasting, not just during Ramadan, but the Sufis would often fast regularly, sometimes like every day, or at least there's a tradition you fast Mondays and Thursdays, or for the 3 middle days of the month, I think it's like the 13th, 14th, and 15th of each month. And so they did a lot of fasting, a lot of again, seclusion, not just ritualized seclusion, but like staying away from public contexts and other people, not fully, of course, they're integrated citizens and so on, but staying away too much from what should I use, like entertainment and classic like asceticism, basically. But the interesting thing about all these practices, including dhikr and sama and the meditation, is how diverse they have been. So depending on where in the world you go, both back then and today, these practices will look very different. So in India, which you mentioned, there's the Chishti order, for example, and they have a lot of focus on music. They developed this music known as qawwali, which is very famous. It's like this incredibly colorful and deeply rich music tradition that's very ecstatic and very, very, very beautiful. Whereas in, let's say, West Africa, there's music there too, but it's much more subdued. It's not as much. And even the dhikr will be quite simple. So it differs a lot. And then on top of that, there are many practices that develop uniquely to each region. So in Turkey, you have the whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, which really is only found, I mean, it has spread to other parts of the world, but it's generally only found in that context. In India, there is that interaction with the yogic tradition that you mentioned, which is so interesting. And we do see, especially in the later Middle Ages and the Mughal period, many practices develop in the Sufi context that is, at least from a sort of overarching academic perspective, is clearly either influenced or at the very least very much in conversation with yogis in India. Maybe we could get into that a bit more later on. But you have these practices in Sufism, even aside from the Indian connection, of meditation, not just of chanting, but silent meditation too, where you will do different breathing exercises, for example. There is one called pas and fas, that's a Persian term, I believe. It's like guarding your breath, where you focus on your breath and you inhale, you say either la ilaha, and exhale, you say, or you don't say, you think, sorry, and you think illallah as you exhale, or sometimes you inhale, you say Allah, or think Allah, and when you exhale, you say Hu. There is also a practice known as dhikr qalbi, so the dhikr of the heart, which is where you focus on listening to your heartbeat and imagining that each heartbeat is pronouncing the name Allah at every heartbeat. So there are many of these kinds of practices, and again, they differ, and each region has these unique practices too, and because you mentioned India, like that's one of the maybe richest examples of just a whole ocean of different meditative and even, like, frankly, yogic practices, even though the Sufis might not call it that, at least not all of them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's really interesting how everything can merge together and have the same. It's definitely so many different paths to similar goals and experiences. Then, of course, everyone who practices religions don't have that same goal, because it's so different the way we practice spirituality or religion. But I love this topic of oneness. Is it Tawhid in Sufism, or?
Yeah, that's at least one of the common terms. Yeah, Tawhid.
Yeah. And it seems like there is it's like using our senses and our physical body as a tool, usually, right, for it, either being fully in it and doing being in contact with the senses, or trying to, because that's also in the yogic path, or you're trying to disconnect a little bit to come above it and become a little bit more the observer of yourself and everything. So it's like different perspectives, but I'm thinking about the oneness aspects of that mystical experience. It's kind of like, because we talked about annihilation and experiencing oneness with the divine and God, and the many ways of doing that, and how we spoke, I think, last time about the current different traditions, and we've all seen the different, or when we talk about oneness, but then we have like the ecstatic part, which might be more connected to bliss, which is also something that is spoken about a lot in it kind of feels like they can be the same, but at the same time, some of the practices that I've seen and shared with you from my motherlands, it's must be as an ecstatic practice. I don't know what the question is, but I'm wondering now in the world, how is that? It feels like an inner and outer practice. That's what I want to
Yeah.
come to. I don't know if how it looks since you've studied it so extensively and traveled. How can it differ between different countries, and how do you think that there's been integrations with local traditional practices that were pre-Islamic in those countries as well?
Yeah, now we're really getting into the good stuff. Yes, I think just from a neutral, I mean, as neutral as possible standpoint, it's hard to deny that local practices have influenced certain forms of Sufism, or Islam generally too, right? And that's one of the things that we often hear about many of those old Sufi masters who were so important for spreading Islam generally around the world. I mean, of course, Islam came to many parts of the world through military conquest, but a lot of it, at least, especially in terms of reaching the people, the regular people, to come to the religion, or to that was often done through the Sufis and the Sufi sheikhs. And one of the ways that they did that, it is said at least, is that they were relatively open to local traditions and to incorporating aspects of that, as long as it didn't completely contradict some basic teachings of Islam, of course, incorporating that somehow into the practice. India is a really good example. The founder, or not the founder, but the most important figure of the Chishti order, which is the most major order there, I believe, Muinuddin Chishti, he came to India, to Ajmer, and he is said to have very much adapted is a strange word, but he got to know the local culture, let's say. He understood, for example, how much music was important to the people there. And of course, music was a part of Sufism already, but it was, some Sufis didn't use music at all, some did, but he very much made music an important part of his teaching and his practice, because he understood that that's what this culture, that's the way this culture works, right? And so on, and being open to these different expressions. So definitely, I think in that way, local customs, local traditions, local ways of being and doing things have influenced Sufism, and that's true still today. I was in Senegal, for example. I did my master's thesis on West African Sufism, and just in the way, and this might be a shallow observation, but it's true. When you go to a West African Sufi hadra or meeting, and they will do the dhikr, and the dhikr in content will be the same. They say La ilaha illallah and Muhammad Rasulullah, etc. But just the way they sing, like the melodies and the rhythms, is very West African, right? So it's a really beautiful how cultures influence each other like that. At least that's how I feel. When you talk about oneness and this relationship between oneness and this experience of oneness, but also the outer experience and the importance of the body, and that's one of the things that I think characterizes Sufism a lot, is that yes, we talk about fana as being one of the main goals of Sufism, but that's never, or very rarely, I should say, is not considered the final stop on the way. Rather, once you have experienced your own nothingness. You had transcended the multiplicity of apparent reality of the world, and you realize that there is only this oneness, which is the divine, the tawheed, the unity of the divine. You have that experience, but what happens after is that you return. You come back to multiplicity, because multiplicity is real. It's often compared to Advaita Vedanta and so on, and there are many similarities. And of course, Advaita does not teach the world is completely untrue, unreal, but there is a focus there on multiplicity. Is just it's an appearance, it's an illusion, it's something to be rejected in a certain sense. I'm not an expert on Advaita, but in Sufism, in teachers like Ibn Arabi, multiplicity is somehow integrated into the oneness. So yes, there is just one being, one reality, which is the being of God, according to Ibn Arabi, who is one of the great Sufi teachers. But that oneness expresses itself in multiplicity. And so multiplicity is real and should be taken seriously. And that is expressed in this idea that after you reach fana, annihilation, you come back into multiplicity. And this is known as baqa, or subsisting in God. So now you are an individual again, and you take that role as an individual seriously, but you now see multiplicity as an expression of oneness. You see oneness behind the multiplicity. And what that leads to, hopefully, is more engagement in the world, in the sense of more compassion, right? You realize that, oh, we're all part of this unity. We're all the same in some sense, which naturally will lead to sort of uncompromising and infinite love for your fellow human being or your fellow creature. Because as there's a hadith Qudsi, which is almost identical to a section in the Gospel of Matthew, actually, which I'm probably misquoting somehow, but so excuse that. But it says, it's this thing where God speaks through Muhammad saying, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was cold and you did not clothe me, right? So to understand, to come back from fana and oneness into subsistence, into multiplicity, is then realizing that to feed the poor is to, and this sounds radical and heretical, but it's true from a certain sense, is to help God, right? Because it's all part of this oneness. So the Sufi path is not this path of escaping the world. It's escaping the world and secluding yourself can be a part of the path. It can be a temporary method on the path, but that's not the end goal. The goal of those practices and experiencing that oneness is to be able to engage more holistically and fully and with more love in multiplicity, and understanding that multiplicity as real and divine in itself, and as an expression of that oneness. So in that way, I feel like it's there are similarities with Advaita, but I feel like I've had a great interest in the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, like Abhinavagupta is I think it's an incredible genius, and I see a lot of similarities with between Abhinavagupta and Ibn Arabi, for example, in many ways, but especially maybe in this sense of, like, yes, it's a kind of non-duality, but not really, because it's a non-duality where duality is part of the non-duality in a very profound sense. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent, but the bodily, the outer and the inner, the zahir and the batin, as it's known in Arabic, are integrated. They're both important. So there's outer practice, both in terms of the dhikr and the meditation, like using your body as a tool, as you explain, but also in terms of being a compassionate person, giving to charity and helping people in need, or being kind, or working on your working on your nafs, right, your ego, but in an active sense. And like, how are you as a fellow human being? How are you treating your spouse? How are you as a friend or as a father or whatever it is? That's also part of the path, as well as this inner journey of transcending that self. But again, that transcending the self is not a disengagement from reality, from multiplicity.
That was a great explanation and many parallels to. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It was really, you put it so well that.
Thank you.
Exactly like you said, it's so different to take. How do you say it? It's a difference to be trying to disattach from the world or try to practice, and like you said, in tantric traditions, it's more grounded into like being here and now, and like you said, it's karma yoga, and it's about being in the world. And I think that's interesting, that how you've seen similarities between those, because it feels like we're all part of one conscious being, so it must be like a spider web with different thought traditions. And I feel like, just from a higher perspective, and yeah, being in that type of practice of trying to have a relationship, to experience, and to transcend but be within the body, is so important. Because if we look at many traditions, especially for these 2000 years, it's been kind of like seeing the body as something not to be either connected to, or to, it's a lot of regulations around restricting the body. And then when we come to these more feminine based practices, it's all about being in the body, and to be embodied, and to have that balance. So it's really good, because the Sufism has those 5 pillars within it, where it's actually important to be part of society, and to give, and to be embodied, and to be human, and at the same time constantly remembering. Because
Yes.
I feel like it is in the non-remembers, when we forget that, that's when we suffer the most. As soon as we remember, oh, okay, we're part of something, and there's a plan for us, and we have some mystical. I think everyone can have a mystical experience if we're open to it. It would be strange. I mean, I feel like birth is a mystical experience, so we all been part of that as well. Conception. But I'm also really curious, because this is, for me, the closest that we come to mantras. It's the recitation of prayer, which is really beautiful and very unique, because it's really beautiful. And then, I don't know, last time, if we tapped into the 99 names and the structure of that whole. I don't think many people know about the 99 names of God.
Yeah, that could be the topic for a whole podcast. Yeah, no, then, so in Islam, or in Sufism and Islam, God has many names, and in the Quran, or it is thought that there are 99 names mentioned in the Quran. According to many Sufi teachers like Ibn Arabi, the names of God are actually infinite, but we know 99 names of God through how God describes himself, right, in the Quran. And in Sufism, these names are very potent, they're very powerful, and they are used a lot. So, and for different circumstances. So we have names like Ar-Rahman, the merciful. I don't like the merciful as a translation that much. I sometimes translate it as the lovingly merciful, to include that aspect of love, which I feel like is so important part of the word Rahma. There is Al-Wadud, the loving. There is Al-Ahad, the One, and there are a bunch of these, again, 99 names that God is referred to by. But, okay, where should I begin here? So I can speak from the perspective of the school of Ibn Arabi again, which I know the best, and which has been essentially the paradigm followed by the majority of that's a bit bold to say the majority, but a huge part of Sufis, historically at least. And his perspective on things is there's this oneness of reality, which later became as wahdat al-wujud, but multiplicity. What creation is a reflection and manifestation of these names of God. He traces this back to a hadith Qudsi where God says, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the world that I might be known. And he understands this hidden treasure that God is as being this treasure containing all these names and attributes. And he wants to know himself. God wants to know himself, which he always does, of course, but he wants to know himself in a mode that is other than his eternal self-knowing. So he wants to know himself and experience himself through the perspective of someone other than himself, which is a kind of false, illusory duality, you could say. And that's how the world is created, to manifest and to reflect all these infinite names, of which the 99 are just a few. And so the whole world, all of creation, not just as it is right now, but the infinite, maybe space of the universe, but also every moment in time that will ever be and ever has been. All of it is a complete reflection of the divine attributes as the macrocosm. And then the human being is very significant in this creation story, because the human being is the microcosm. It's a comprehensive being. Ibn Arabi says in his most famous, or his most probably his most famous work, the Fusus al-Hikam, the Ringstones of Wisdom. He begins the very first chapter. It says that the real al-Haq, God, wanted to see himself or experience himself in a comprehensive being, and that's when he created Adam, right? So the human being. So the human being is this ocean without a shore that can also contain and manifest and mirror this infinity of divine attributes, just as the outer universe also reflects them. So in that tradition, it's often seen as there are 3 Qurans, 3 books of God. There is the universe as a whole, which is a divine scripture. There is the human being, which is another divine scripture, which reflects all the names. And then there is the book of the Quran as we know it. So the names are really the archetypes of everything that we experience, whether it is within ourselves or outside ourselves. And we see a beautiful sunset. What we're experiencing is al-jamal, the beautiful, the very reality and attribute of beauty, which is what God is, or the one aspect of what God is. And we're seeing just a tiny reflection of that divine beauty in that sunset or in another human being or whatever it may be. So part of the path is to cultivate your ability to recognize that as the Quran says, whichever way you turn, there is the face of God. And this is how Ibn Arabi interprets that whichever way you turn, there is a manifestation, a reflection of these names and these attributes of God. And also within yourself, to be able to embody and reflect those attributes in yourself. This is also the purpose of these meditations. So a sheikh, a master, will often give his student, depending on where he sees the student being on the path, what he needs that moment, he may tell him that now you should do dhikr, like for yourself every day, on these particular names. Like right now you need to focus on Ar-Rahman, for example, for some reason, to help that development, and partly also to invoke that name into one's heart. is one way of looking at it. So when we say Ya Wadud, oh the loving, we are invoking God, as in we're speaking to this external force. I say we, but I mean the Sufis. But what we're also doing, what they're also doing, is invoking that name in order to make that name manifest or alight within their own heart, so that they can embody the attributes of loving, or of love, or of merciful, or of all these different names. So there are many long books, for example, of the divine names. Many of the Sufis wrote, Ibn Arabi included, and many other Sufis wrote these books about the divine names that's dedicated to, I can take Ibn Arabi as an example. There are 3 sections to each name. So it's like, okay, here's the name Ar-Rahman. Here's what the name means in a very basic sense. Here is how that name, I forget the second part is. It's like how the name is maybe manifest, how we can recognize that name in manifestation, perhaps. And then the third part is how can you internalize and embody that name. So it really is also comparing to other traditions, like there is the Latin term imitatio Dei, right, to imitate God, which is common in Western Christianity, or aspects of Kabbalah that you mentioned, like Jewish mysticism is also about becoming like God. Maimonides talks about this, and Cordovero talks about this in the Jewish tradition. I think you know this better than I do, but I think there are similar ideas in Indic traditions as well. And this is very much true in Sufism, is that the goal is to become this pure being. So the mirror is a good image there. I've said this before, right? That the goal is to sort of clean the mirror of your heart, so that your heart can mirror these attributes and names fully. And when you reach Fana, for instance, when you annihilate yourself, what that should be is not as we also talked about, it's not a rejection of your individuality complete. I mean, it is in a sense, but it's not your individual role as a human being, but your individuality should be like a pure mirror that simply reflects the divine light that comes to you. Or those divine names and attributes, right, that wants to manifest through you. This is what Ibn Arabi means in his most famous poem, when he says, my heart has become capable of all forms. And then he lists, like, it's a pasture for the gazelles, it's a cloister for the monks, it's a temple for idols, it's the Kaaba for pilgrims, it's the scrolls of the Torah, it's the pages of the Quran. And then he says, I follow the religion of love. This is what he means, right? It's not a statement of pluralism, like religious pluralism. Well, it could be, you could extend the idea to mean that, but that's not what he meant. What he means is that the accomplished mystic is the one who has become so open to receiving any form of God that he experiences outwardly, seeing everything as God, whether it's that gazelle or that cloister, whatever, and also internally being able to embody and manifest within oneself any form, any manifestation, any name, or any attribute.
That's beautifully described. Thank you so much. And it is very similar to, like you said, in different traditions, as, for example, 1008 names of Lalita Tripura Sundari, for example, and it describes if she is the definition of what is God. It's one name of God in a feminine form. Then it's like different descriptions of. It's like also describing the physical form, which is different in Islam and the 99 names, which is more like inner attributes, but there
Yeah.
it's describes the so you get like a picture, so you can relate in a different way, right? It's so different to relate to a oneness and a eternal consciousness, and then it's a different thing to have that in a humanized form. It's two different types of meditation, so it's like impossible almost to compare. But something that hit me when we now talked about microcosm and macrocosm, and it might be a conversation next time. We have like 2 more episodes, me and you, 99 names, and then the cosmology would be so interesting to talk about.
Yes.
So this would just this will never end. But this is one thing that I'm thinking about, the also like within, I think you've covered it in, you have spoken about astrology and numerology, right? In
A little bit, at least. Yeah, astrology and a bit of the ilm al-huruf, right? The letterism.
yeah.
Numerology, I'm not. It's part of that same conversation, but it's an
Yeah.
aspect that I'm not as well versed in, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask you another question? It's about how it's spelled, Tauba or Toba. It's one of the practice or something that you do, which is also true in different other traditions. It can be called repentance, or it's in Sufism in particular. Is there specific practices for that, or is it just the act of reflecting on what we do and what we don't feel is aligned with where we want to go? Or what have you seen in your studies?
It's definitely there. It's not ritualized always in that way, but it's a general part of the path that you're always supposed to reflect on yourself and your actions. Sometimes it's been more. It's become a more particular practice. One of the earliest Sufis. It's so early that it's there's a question whether he can be called a Sufi, but he's one of those people in Baghdad in the very early centuries. He was known as al-Muhasibi, and al-Muhasibi means the one who does muhasab or muhasaba, which is like self examination basically. And so he was famous for doing that. I don't remember exactly his method of doing it, but it was like he would actively each day either write down or sit and just think about what he had done the whole day. And then if he recognized something as being, as you described, not aligned with the path or with the divine will, he would seek forgiveness for it. Again, I can return to Ibn Arabi because again, it's a person who I've studied quite deeply. So a lot of my everything sort of is somehow related to him when I speak of these things. But he adapted that same method, and he tells us a bit more specifically about what he would do. He would write down. I'm not sure how he did that, if he did it like as he was going about his day or if he did it afterwards, but he would write down in a notebook everything that he had done, or anything that he noticed as being out of place, maybe that he had done or even thought about, like sinful thoughts or something. And then at night he would sit and he would read these things and he would contemplate all his actions and all his thoughts and assess, he would, if they were bad, then he would seek forgiveness. So you can do in common Sufi practices to also say astaghfirullah, which means I seek forgiveness from God, as a kind of zikr. Or sometimes if he had done good things, I can't remember if he would do something then, or if he would just like leave that as being a good deed. But in his case, and there are many such cases where that has become a kind of a set practice that one would do each day, especially in that tradition of muhasibi, which Ibn Arabi had taken from one of his sheikhs in Andalusia back then. That was one of the lineages or the traditions that he studied under, and so he probably got that from them. So it's definitely there. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And what I want to ask more questions, but I want to have a final question because I feel like we have other things that we could talk about again.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what mystical experiences you have had, if
Oh, wow.
any.
It's bad manners to talk about them too much. Maybe no, no, it's not. That's not what I mean. But I would say that I've had experiences that I could describe as mystical. I'm actually writing. We'll see what becomes of it. But I'm writing something, whether it's a book or whatever, that it does contain some more personal reflections and experiences. I can share maybe two, if you have time. This is the one that one that I usually tell because it's not that dramatic. But I was quite young. I was in Venice. It's going to sound very out there. I don't think I've told this in public before. But I was sitting by the canals in Venice. 2014. I was 21 or 20, and I was looking at the water. It was at night, so I was transfixed by the street lights that were reflecting on the surface of the water, and the water was moving, so it was like glittering on this water, and I was like I thought it was beautiful, so I was just staring at that light. And then out of nowhere, or it's not out of nowhere, but it happened that there was a bird that suddenly landed right in this spot of the glittering light that I was looking at. There's nothing special about that happening at all, but something happened to me when that bird landed. I was struck by this sense of clarity and like what's the word I should use? Like obviousness. Again, I can't describe it. That's the theme we talked about, right? It's like it's one of those things where I can't really put it into words. The only way that I've been able to put it into words for other people when I've described this is that it was like I knew the answer, but I didn't really know what the question was. But something just felt very clear and obvious to me, and I was staring at this bird, and I thought I'd been staring at it for maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Apparently, then the person who's now my wife, she sort of patted me on the shoulder. She was like, "We need to go." And apparently, I had been sort of sitting in this position for, I think it was 10 minutes or something, or 10, 15 minutes. So I was somewhere else. So that was an interesting experience, and I think also that affected me a lot because, and I only drew this connection earlier this year as I was writing this, is that it was about 6 months later that I started studying religion at university. So maybe that was me like trying to seek out or study deeper something of what I had experienced. The second thing I want to bring up, which I think is more powerful, and I've told many times. I'm sick of myself. I'm sick of hearing myself talk about it. But I worked as a teacher for a couple of years here in Stockholm, and to make a very long story short, that's the other part of it, that embodied part, that part of it that is almost a mystical experience through service, because as I was working as a teacher or as a student assistant with these younger kids, there was this sense of complete. It was a kind of transcendent experience in the sense that it didn't feel like it was me, or my ego at least, doing this. It was like love was happening through me, but like I didn't really have any causative role in it. And just being able to serve others and be there for others and help others in a way that was completely without ego. At least that's how I experienced it. And this feeling of having total what's the word, villkorslöst in Swedish, unconditional love and care that felt more real than anything else I've ever experienced. And that made me develop what I would say, like, spiritually infinitely faster in those 2 years than I had studying all these traditions intellectually for 10 years prior. So that's probably the strongest thing.
That's really beautiful. It feels like the first experience, it might have been like a divine sign that a new path was beginning for you, and to understand, maybe preparing you, if like preparing your, it gave you an experience of what you would study, so it can actually be easier to study something when you embody it. And then, I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it, but and the second experience sounds, it's that is also oneness, when you feel like you're part of something, where you in the yogic tradition, when you're serving others, you're also serving God, or like that whole thing. And if that's not one of the most important services, because then you are actually one with others and one with everything, and it is heart expansive.
That's a
Because
very good way of putting it, actually.
yeah, it's when we are isolating and constricting, we don't open up, like upward and within the heart. There's so much that is based there. So that's why I really love the Bhakti tradition. It's heart based, and it's like through that love, because love is also many layers. So it's like you said, unconditional love, that experience of divine love, and how we can also feel nurtured by it. And I really love those experiences for you. It's
Thank you. Me too.
so yeah. I would love to continue our conversations, as we said last time, and we did continue, because I think this was the the topic that we discussed last time. But how can people find you? I will link everything, but maybe just share how people can connect with your work.
Sure, thank you. You can find me primarily, especially if you want to find me discussing these kinds of topics, then I'm on YouTube. The channel is called Let's Talk Religion. There is also the podcast version of that, which is also called Let's Talk Religion, and that's available wherever you find your podcasts, basically. I also do music, if that's of interest, and so I have another channel dedicated to that called just my name, Filip Holm, and then I release music also on Spotify and so on under my name and under a project or collaborative band situation called Zini. So that's currently what I'm working on, so to say.
Great. I really recommend everyone to subscribe to Filip's channel. I think it's the best channel where you get so much great information, and like, it's so beautiful. I really love it and followed it for a long time. So I really appreciate your work, and to have you here again. I'm really excited to talk very soon again, not in 6 months, hopefully sooner than that, and share, because there's so much to cover. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to everyone who's listened as well.